So welcome back to the second out of 4 panel discussions. This group is called Tactile Objects. It was curated by myself. Joining us are Michael Loverich, Ellie Abrons, and Andrew Holder. I'm just gonna... This is going to be more informal than I think this afternoon or this morning's panel, but I'm just going to read the bios to get it out of the way and be proper. So Ellie Abrons is a lecturer in architecture at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, where she was the A. Alfred Taubman Fellow in 2009-2010. She recently spent 6 months in Stuttgart, Germany, where she was a resident fellow at the Academy Schloss Solitude. This summer, Ellie was invited to participate in the 13th International Architecture Exhibition at the Venice Biennale. Ellie received her MArch from the University of California, Los Angeles, where she graduated with distinction and received the AIA Certificate of Merit. She received her BA in Art History and Gender Studies from NYU and has a certificate in Graphic and Digital Design from Parsons School of Design. She has worked in numerous offices in Los Angeles and Boston, such as Servo, Gregland Form, and Office Da. Andrew Holder is an architect, critic, and occasional author. He is currently the 2012-2013 Oberdick Fellow at the University of Michigan and co-principal of the LADG, where his design interests include repurposing common or outmoded drawing techniques, inventing architectural characters, and inducing states of play in an audience. I guess I should also say that Andrew practices with Ben Freinger, his partner. Andrew has held teaching appointments at UCLA, SCI-Arc, and Otis College of Art and Design, and is a frequent guest critic at institutions across the country. Prior to his career in architecture, Andrew's professional lives include work in real estate finance, and tax credit syndication with the National Equity Fund, and a stint as director of business development for a technology startup using statistical analysis of language for novel information storage and retrieval systems. I don't even know what that means.
Where did you find this bio?
I think you gave it to me. Andrew received his Master's of Architecture degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, where he graduated with distinction, summa cum laude, from Lewis and Clark, it's his Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science. He is a Truman Scholar and a recipient of the Oberdick Fellowship, the AIA Certificate, the Robin B. Pamlin Jr. Fellowship, and the Barbara Hershey Neely Scholarship. Michael Loverich co-founded BITTERTANG with Antonio Torres so they could create humorous and pleasurable environments. Their work uses fables and narrative to build new worlds that explore frothiness, biological matter, animal posturing, and babies, all unified together through Bel Composto. Recently, they have built 3 inflatable pavilions, a pregnant, sugar-oozing piñata, a plush toy collection, a sagging birdcage, and won the Architectural League Prize in 2010. And he writes good bios. So I wanted to bring this particular panel together for a very specific and selfish reason. So as Jeff mentioned last night, a lot of us kids are from UCLA. All of us kids are from UCLA. And I think our work is very close and shares a lot of qualities and ideas and traits. And I was hoping that by putting this group together, which is very similar in sensibility, that we could maybe get at some of the nuanced differences and try to expose those and make those a kind of productive discursive point. So we were all at UCLA around the same time. This was the mid-2000s, or early to mid-2000s. Our time there more or less corresponded with Sylvia Lavin's tenure, like the end of Sylvia Lavin's tenure as the chair. Over that time, she was chair for 10 years. The school gained a great deal of technological expertise, but there was a shift happening, which I also mentioned last night in the conference intro, which was pressuring digital formalism to reconsider itself or reconstitute itself under new terms, new discursive terms. So the moment was characterized by a high level of expertise, and also a kind of discursive, I think, anxiety and freedom. I think the theories were a little difficult at the start, but in that ambiguity there was a lot of sort of projection and experimentation that I think set up a lot of the projects that the three of these guys have been working on ever since. So I think it was a formative time, and I want to talk about their work specifically in relation to that time period and try to maybe frame it in a recent history in that sense. So I'm going to do a couple things which are also different from this afternoon's panel. Instead of presenting the work extensively of each practice, I'm going to show a couple images of all the projects that will come up, or that I have images of in the slideshow, and then talk about the work in terms of how it relates to a few ideas that I've bullet pointed. Also, instead of characterizing the work in terms of a historical lineage, I'm only going to show one project, which is a project done by Jason Payne and Heather Roberge when they were together as principals of New Form. This was 2005, 2006, and it's a project which I think has within it a lot of the characteristics that are have been developed more rigorously and extensively in the practices of the three panelists. So I'm going to explain it briefly, outline some bullet points, and then we're going to kind of work through the ideas and hopefully get some dialogue with the rest of the crowd as well. So this is a project. It's a bar. It's situated within an interior renovation for NGTV, which is No Good Television, which is something between, a cross between like the Playboy channel and E. So it has a very particular kind of sensibility to it. Risque activities happen there. Lots of like, the CEO's office is in the middle of this big kind of lobby space, and it's a glass container. It's got like giant pink dildos everywhere. There's half-naked women running around. It's a very particular atmosphere which allowed them to generate this kind of narrative of experience that was provocative in the way that I think the client and what they do is provocative. So there's an existing bar, which is this semicircular shape, and they clad it with a series of plastic panels. The form is loosely based on a poppy seed, and then panelized, CNC routed, vacuum formed, painted, lit with LED lights from within. But there's a particular, this is a diagram that's on Jason Payne's website now. Jason and Heather have since split and have different practices, but so this diagram, this was a moment that they developed a very literal connection between an object and the way in which that object was experienced physically. So the bulge in the panels down here below was meant to literally rub against the groins of the people at the bar. And then these moments up here of surface articulation were meant to be like points of kind of desirous gaze or visual stimulation. They they stuffed pink fur in the cracks between the panels. And then there was a detail on the inside where they were coating the inside of the bar with leather and then pinching it together, piercing it with like belly button or belly bars, and then like exposing pink fur. So you can see the sort of overtones of this like way of thinking and conceiving of form. And then, in case you couldn't make the connection, like people would stick their fingers in it, and they drew that. So I think that in this project, so Jason and Heather for a long time had been interested in hair. They were interested in it in terms of its kind of as a morphological diagram, so what it lended to architectural design in terms of thinking about geometry and materiality. This was a moment when they literalized fur in a way and stuffed faux fur into their project, and it was meant to be engaged tactilely. So I guess, and then another thing is that the idea was that as the night kind of progressed and people consumed more alcohol, they would start rubbing it more, they would start grinding on it more. I mean, it was, it's funny, but I think that there was a very specific idea about how the thing was engaged, which tied to its formal and material articulation. So I'm going to just very briefly talk about the projects that I'm going to show for the three panelists. I'm going to describe them very quickly and not really get into them very much, but just if we reference them, the idea is that if we reference them in conversation, you'll have some frame of reference instead of waiting till they come up in the sequence of the slideshow. So this is an image of Andrew Holder's research that he's doing currently as the Oberdick Fellow at the University of Michigan. It's a series of plaster casts. It's tied closely, obviously, to his workshop. But he's developed kind of custom techniques of casting plaster in balloons and prodding it with objects to get this pretty incredible formal articulation. And then working with how they nest together in larger systems, which I think is the current state of the research right now. This is a project by his firm, the LADG. It's called Pigs in Box. Giant metallic balloons stuffed into a space. It's a pop-up fashion store. This is a competition, highly specific formally, and then stuffed in a box. Hence the Pigs in Box. This is Apothecary, another project by the LADG where they did a form of renovation for an interior. The main focus was on these objects, these display objects which sat in the space, which were based off of, like water sacks. You guys were testing the ways that water sacks slumped, and then they became these objects, and they serve as displays for these for the merchandise in the store. This is Burblebup from BITTERTANG. That's a mouthful. This was the City of Dreams Pavilion in 2010, so a couple years ago. It's kind of a project in two parts. One is these sausages of netting and wood chips, and then a series of custom designed balloons that are strapped together that sit on top of it like a hat. This is Blow Pup. This is a project BITTERTANG did for the Sukkah competition, also a couple of years ago. Inflatable tube, a series, what are the rods on top, bamboo or something? Bamboo, and then a series of hanging vegetation on the inside. This is a project actually that Mikey and his partner did at UCLA for Jason Payne's studio called Rumpus Room, which I think is still an amazing project and offers great points to the conversation. So this was an interior of I guess like a pretty simple house in two parts. One is a children's dream den, and then the children's room down below. So the children climb up in here, and there's this thick upholstered room that they crawl around in. This is Mustachio. They do a series of plush toys. This is one of them. We'll talk about it. Sorry, this is mislabeled. This is Romulus and Remus. This is what they did for the Architectural League Prize show. It's a succulent piñata. This is a project that Ellie and I did in collaboration called Tingle Room. This was an installation in a bedroom in a domestic house in Detroit. There's a few materials. There's a shifting, offsetting plywood box that cracks open and exposes this worked foam on the inside, and then a series of steel cables which form a kind of field of thin hairs that people rub. This is another collaboration between the two of us called Stubble Step for the recent Biennale. There was a series of 4x4 cedar posts which were created as step landscape, and then there's these moments of material saturation which are foam, flocking, gold leaf, these sort of strange hot spots which provide kind of moments of sort of tactile intensity. So these are the ideas. So again, I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to try to frame these ideas in relation to specific images of the projects and specific characteristics of those projects. In general, we're going to be working towards, let's say, a more explicit statement about why objects as a category of formal production are useful for architecture. Not just fun things for architects to do, but what they lend architecture as a discipline. So this is kind of a meta question, let's say. And I'm hoping to do some work to articulate that together as opposed to stating out front a thesis. And then we're going to work through some of these issues. So there's another thing which is, I'm actually glad that we're going after this morning's panel, because I think some of the things that were brought up in the discussion there are very relevant and very useful, and there will be a lot of overlap. And I wanted to start with this, a question of the relationship of object to space, which I think gets to the issue of scale that was brought up earlier, and potentially interiority and exteriority. So the object, the easiest way to access the idea of objects with BITTERTANG is their design of objects, their design of toys, which sit on a wall or a bed as an object. There's the two projects that I want to show for the LADG, I think are great projects to think about in relation to the idea of tactile objects or objects in general, because they had real clients, real program. They had to think about how to both extend the research and interest in object design, but then also how to think about it in relation to the straightforward constraints of a merchandise commercial store. So in this case, the objects sit in the space. They organize people moving around them, and then they act as magnets for the kind of merchandise of the space. So people walk around them and probably have a fluctuating attention to the thing as an object itself, and then also the things on top of it. And they also are highly articulated. This is the interior of the objects. So there's a series of ribs which are painted purple, the rest of it painted red, a hanging light. So these things have their own kind of formal articulation, which if somebody gets down and looks into, has a kind of visual intensity to it. Not occupiable, but visual. And then the Pigs in Box project, which I think is particularly interesting in relation to this question of scale, because here, the size of the balloon in relation to the space disallows any reading of the object in total. So instead of these projects, which you understand as objects that you can move around and understand in their, as a whole, here the oversized nature of the balloon allows you to never really get a full reading of the thing. So instead what you have is a series of spatial zones where you're in differential relationships to the balloon itself or to the pig, sometimes being squeezed underneath it, or like squeezed out of the butt. I mean, you can't really say anything else there, I don't think. But there's an interesting relationship here. So the size of it allows you to experience it in parts, which I think is more of, to me, is a useful way of thinking about how you deal with scale and object making within architecture and understand the experience of it as a series of episodes or a series of, Andrew's referred to this multiple times as like a space planning exercise. So different ways of understanding it that are revealed in time and within movement, which I think are characteristics specific to architecture, more so than like toy design or something like this. And then going back to Rumpus Room, here there's an interesting, almost full connection of these figures here, which are like kind of figured not balloons, they all look the same, figured like pillows, but connected to the underlying upholstered base. So it's somewhere between an object and a thick liner, which I think is an interesting point of connection. It's not necessarily one or the other. And then the way that they fabricated it was actually pretty systematic in that they routed out these molds and cast foam and then upholstered them. And photos of the interior of the model, actually, you start to lose the reading of that figural pillow against the backdrop, and it becomes more seamless. So I think this will be the first moment that I open it up to the panel, and just to think about maybe in general how you think about scale, but then also maybe for you, Mikey, in particular, is there an evolution happening in terms of the way in which you think about objects in relation to the architectural context or as architecture? Or do you kind of move, do you change that conception based on the project? And I think for Andrew, similar questions about how you, I know it's explicit and I think you could probably explain it better than I can about the size, the relationship of that thing to the interior space, but maybe if you guys can weigh in on that question of scale, size, and its connection to an architectural surround.
Yes. So I think you did a pretty good job of setting up our ambition, which was to basically overstuff a box to suppress the total reading of a figure so that you would only encounter it in a kind of series of parts as you moved throughout the store. And for us, it had to do both with the suppression of the total reading of the figure simultaneously, but it also had to do with kind of carefully scripting the frame of attention. So I think in some instances in that store, like the balloons actually invite a kind of tactile frame of attention where one might reach out and kind of stroke a furry underbelly. And that would be a sort of sensual or tactile experience. I think the overstuffing allows a kind of separate frame of attention that exfoliates to a kind of abstraction. So unless you are actually navigating the store with a plan, you actually cannot understand the kind of full choreography of the space plan simultaneously. Instead, it is sort of revealed to you in parts, and there is this abstract thing that you do not understand all at the same time that is slowly pieced together over time. So it's redirecting the frame of attention from like sensation and the immediate to cognition, to a kind of abstract plane. So the overstuffing gave us this kind of both-and condition where we could be sensual and naughty and in the business of stroking tummies, and also kind of coldly analytic and rigorous and referring attention back to this sort of abstract cognitive plane. So that's what scale basically did for us. And the bigger the balloons got, the more carefully we could sort of oscillate between those frames of attention.
Do you consider it like a development, like an evolution of the work, in a sense that this strategy? Because to me it seems, again, like I'm trying to think about the use value of thinking about object in relation to architecture, and that one seems to work more architectural to me than just like an object in a space. In terms of the way it differentiates the space, it defines zones, and it sets up a kind of states of experience that play out in time. Do you see that as an evolution or just a strategy among many strategies that you would essentially bounce back and forth from?
Yeah, I'd say an evolution that made me very uncomfortable, that's now leading us to take several steps backward and begin again smaller and work our way up. So maybe this is sort of in reference to Menez's comment early this afternoon about maybe the kind of first stabs at large-scale work being in concrete, because they can't receive the kind of intense degree of attention all over that a smaller object might be able to. I would say it's that kind of loss of mania, or that kind of loss of excess as you move from the small to the large, that I actually want to avoid. So I would say that Pigs in a Box lost a degree of mania, control, and articulation, like infolded into the object, that we want to begin again smaller and figure out how to get big without losing that kind of all-over attention and sort of manic obsession with the articulation of the thing.
I think for us, does this work? Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the plush toys and the piñata, the scale was more of an issue. I mean, very bluntly, we didn't have much resources, or we couldn't. There wasn't a budget, or we really wanted to make things, and we wanted to make things that would attract the most amount of people, or engage with people the easiest. And so the plush toys, it's something that actually it charges the environment a little bit more. We specifically designed these things so that they would be a little bit creepy. That's also why they're on the walls. They kind of have weird shapes to them. You can't really tell where one body part, or where the mouth might be. You kind of don't want to know where the mouth is. And so there's ways that you could work with smaller objects, but actually affect the mood of the space with very minimal means. It's kind of like walking through a forest. If you know there's bears there, if there's not bears. You're much more fearful if you know there's bears there. But if you don't know, you're skipping around, So that's kind of what this initial stuff was kind of experiments with how much a smaller object can kind of exude. And then, so that's...
But how do you think about Rumpus Room? In particular, this image for me is really interesting because it has the kind of systematicity of an aggregating system, parts logically being put together, but also a simultaneous figural quality in the shapes and the curvature, and then it becomes like this, which is almost figures read against a kind of static backdrop. Have you guys done that again, or
Well,
like that as a strategy in relation to the more explicit objects.
I mean, Burblebop, the inflatable portion of it, was kind of a play off of. It's much more rigid in their organization, but there was something about the piling of these stuffed animals and that sort of form of stacking that we really liked, and the clustering of it that we thought was, getting rid of the object as a single thing, and it becomes more it's easier to turn it into a spatial element once you start clustering them together. And so
that's actually so the next idea that it's a good segue that I wanted to talk about is object to object, which I'm using the word object because we're talking about objects, but also could be a kind of part to part relationship. So the evolution or the work, the direction of the work of Andrew's cast, he's looking at both the articulation of a single element, but also, sorry, these are a little bit out of order, but the way that they snuggle together. So it's no longer about the articulation of a single object, but the way that they can kind of fit together in ways which are more about snuggling and a kind of bodily connection rather than something that's more of a brick, an assembly logic that's not brick-like. Also looking to Greg Lynn's Blob Wall, and I guess last night you showed Aranda Lash's Grotto as another potential precedent. But there's another thing that I want to highlight, which is the explicit connection of the plaster cast and these shapes, which are figural, bodily, evoke sensations of kind of like this kind of perverse and half, silly idea of like squeezing something in a very juvenile way. But there's an intention to frame it within a disciplinary problem, which I think is important. And also, I just want to call attention to that and ask, how you think about the sort of maybe the novelty or the formal development, and then its kind of positioning in history, like a new brick problem. And I think, Mikey, for you as well, the relationship of, in the way that we talked about, which, this is systematic, you can understand it. This is something else. But it's interesting in the sense that it's a problem of snuggling and laying and piling, but there's a connection, an explicit connection to the landscape and a connection to each other, but it's this really weird hybrid of some logic of connection and parts coming together into a whole, which we might understand in architectural terms, but then this really explicit animal character as well. And then I don't know what the hell this is. This is one of the kind of images that explain the narrative of one of the plush toys of Mustachio. I think maybe how they're born or something. Yeah, how they're born. And then turns into this. But this is an interesting thing to me. The way in which you frame it within a disciplinary history and your commitment to that as defining a new brick. I'm assuming you don't have to just say, yes, that's important to me, because I know it's important, but maybe why and how you sort of balance those two, or how you set up the research in order to kind of do work on both fronts, let's say.
Yeah, maybe just to explain the brick problem as I understand it with a bit more specificity. So the way I understand the brick problem, as a descendant of a kind of Beaux-Arts way of thinking about bricks, is that there are self-similar objects where geometry is responsible for generating the fits between adjacent objects. So there are faces that match one another, and it's the matching faces that stack up to create a habitable structure. So I'm interested in the relationship between that and a kind of contemporary working out of the problem where the brick is no longer necessarily like a rectilinear extrusion, as in the case of some of Aranda Lash's work. But I would argue that in their project, it is still the kind of self-similarity of the faces that allows for the matching of one object to another. So you have these matching things that again permit aggregation and kind of the generation of a habitable volume, almost in exactly the same way that like geometry authorizes the same thing happening in a Beaux-Arts wall system. And I would say that even in Blob Wall, Greg Lynn's project, it's still geometry and the matching of face-to-face that authorizes the construction of the aggregation. It's just that the face-to-face problem is no longer operating in 2 dimensions, it's operating in 3 dimensions. So the fit between blobs must be described by a 3-dimensional line in space. So it seemed to me that like pigs suckling, like piglets suckling at a sow, offered a different model for aggregation that no longer relied on geometry to kind of authorize the fits that created the habitable volume, but instead you would have to rely on kind of relationships of character between piglet and sow, like nestling, snuggling, and suckling. So the problem that I'm trying to address with aggregations like this is how to not let them be reducible to a problem of geometry, but instead be regulated by these kind of highly characterized fits, like they snuggle. Mm-hmm. And can you snuggle your way to a building?
We would all like to know the answer to that question. I think
actually, I want to ask a question about pig pile and bricks.
Please.
Yeah. Is that the way to approach pig pile, like as another brick problem?
No. I'm actually glad you brought that up because I haven't actually seen that image in so long. It's kind of hilarious, but that was actually a massing for a gigantic building. And so it was more playing around with piling as a way of dealing with building mass. And then from that, we kind of worked backwards and developed some of the piling of this plush toys. But I mean, I think we made this weird thing that looks kind of like animals, so it looks like a smaller scale thing. So I think even though it was meant as massing, at a much larger scale, it easily was transferable to the smaller kind of brick scale, but we've never kind of addressed it in terms of the brick. But I mean, nesting, snuggling, all that stuff is definitely kind of the tactility of it with the person, like especially in Rumpus Room where the child is underneath it, and just being able to be covered by these bricks, and they're soft so that you can actually be one of the bricks yourself in the scheme of things. I don't know if that.
Feel free to. So the panel is. So I think Andrew and Mikey have a lot of very productive, nuanced differences between their formal articulations. I think tactility as the adjective to object is a kind of bridge, I think, to some of Ellie's work, which will come up as well, but feel free to jump in whenever you want. So these are, I mean, obviously these ideas are all interrelated, so it's hard to, we've already touched on some, and it's hard to not touch on all of them in one conversation of a project, but I also wanted to just call out the relationship of object to subject. And again, this is some of what I started with in the beginning, but the notion of an object as a standalone thing, these as objects that you can move around, and then also the connection, the different kinds of relationships brought about by pigs and box. But I'd like to highlight, this is this idea of subject to object, I think is also tied into the way in which these objects are engaged. So in the case of NGTV bar, it's very explicit the ways in which you are supposed to physically interact with the object. The articulation of the nubs on the top are meant to be kind of like handles that you stroke. The fur you're also supposed to pet, the bulge in the bar you're supposed to rub your groin against. It's a very direct model of experience that they kind of call out through their diagramming. And I think that there's actually quite a bit of difference amongst the panel in total between the ways in which the relationships between the objects and the subjects play themselves out. So this, as a detail of Rumpus Room, you know, the child gets sort of lost within the figured pillows. So there's a conflation of subject and object into one pile, a becoming of the like a becoming pillow in this case of a child. So it's a way. I think it's tied to Jason and Heather's. It's tied to the NGTV bar in that way because it's meant to be physically kind of like hugged and stroked, and like it can't be more explicit than this, which I hadn't seen until last night when you showed it, and then I stole it from you and put it in here. But the diagram of snuggling people, and then the person being replaced by the pillow. So the full personification of the pillow as a kind of equal subject or something like this complete melding of subject and object. Again, here, like, I mean, this maybe not everyone was, saw this as an opportunity to lick, but there is a way in which these objects kind of call an attention to themselves that are engaged physically, which I think is a direct connection. Whereas I think in Andrew's work, it's more about the fit between the parts themselves, the objects themselves snuggle, not you don't meld with the object and become one of them. There's a disconnect from the subject and the object, and this is partially maybe knowledge that I'm privy to because I've had extensive conversations with you that's latent in the work, but I think it's a useful point of distinction. And I know that in particular, I think with Pigs in Box, there's moments when there's, as you were explaining it, tactile engagement, but there's also a kind of quasi-physical experience, which is, you might not actually be touching the pig when you're going through its legs or when you're slipping around it against the wall, but the combination of the formal articulation, which looks like it could be like huggable or squeezable, and the proximity of the person to the architectural surrounds it's like a quasi-physical embrace. It's not literally like these people are hugging the pig. They have a more implied relationship that I think, and for me, like that kind of distinction between literally something that you snuggle with and the different kinds of snuggling between parts, in the case of the plaster cast, and the snuggling, like an implied snuggling between the kind of subject and object in Pigs in Box seems like a useful distinction to kind of like call out, and I think it's the nuance in that which also starts to, let's say, diagram different positions in different ways forward that you can use objects and think about formal articulation and how they're experienced, basically. So, yeah.
So we had this conversation over coffee earlier today, and there was I think a kind of like useful reductive moment where it's like, where do people stand in your project, and are people important? And I think we all like weigh in on that question in very different ways. So maybe because I have the most cynical position, I'll sort of throw mine out there. Like, people are not important to what I am doing. And in fact, I would say that it's what I'm interested in is a kind of oh, I'm back, a sort of assault on the humanist position. So if in a conventional subject-object relationship, there is the kind of all-knowing subject who approaches the object of study and kind of interprets it, and the juice is in the subject, and the object is kind of this passive thing. I am interested in creating objects that use sort of biomorphic rhymes, like they have protrusions and they appear to sort of snuggle, so that the subject can attribute a false vitality to the object. So instead of a subject-object relationship, it's a subject-subject relationship. And I want to make more and more of those things with a kind of like false vitality to them, so that slowly the kind of human position is sort of crowded out by this other position. So it's a kind of slow decentering away from the human ego as the thing that drives the kind of process of interest in architecture. And so I was sort of describing my ideal state would be like a person arriving on a boat to Easter Island for the first time. That would sort of be how I want my human subjects to sort of ultimately feel. Like that degree of estrangement and ego decentering. But I think I'm also kind of alone on the panel in feeling that way about my human subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
Because I think that this kind of anti-humanist angle to work does raise a kind of question. I think a question of relation as well, which is the kind of departure point for the investigation has to do with human sensation. There's a kind of embedded subject in the work, which is being retranslated and deployed in ways that are and deny sensation. Or not deny sensation, but does not maintain a kind of interest in the subject that was part of the original sort of investigation. So I guess I'm wondering, is that kind of intentional? Sort of, it sounds like in your case maybe yes, but I think recognizing the project as a whole, what do you guys think about that problem? Because for me, what it also has suggested in past projects that there was actually more of a formal interest in the work, as opposed to one which is actually sensationalist. And it has to do with that kind of denial of the subject, and the kind of intentional removal of the subject from the kind of construction work.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great question. I think one of the really interesting things about Andrew's work is that you're interested in this kind of denial of the humanist subject, but you also simultaneously rely on the subject. So I think that there is a formal project which is autonomous and disciplinary and not at all interested in the subject. And I'm going to speak about your work, but I think that that's not what you're doing. I think that you're interested in a transcendent moment, but you've actually used this word yourself, but that moment is a relief. So it's not actually a cynical view. In a way, it's like a very optimistic view, or and I think that, well, I could speak for Mikey too, I won't maybe, but I think in my own work, I'm also interested in a kind of subjective transcendence, but one which is not externalizing, but is almost like intensely internalizing. So where the kind of intensity of that subjectivity is heightened or exaggerated to really excessive degrees. Whereas for Andrew, I think that the objects, in a way, are repellent. I mean, they kind of move, they fluctuate between these states of intense engagement, but also like real repellence, which I think is in distinction to my work and to Mikey's work, where there's an overt desire for subjects to intensely engage those objects or those surfaces, literally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm kind of wearing two hats. One is, Ellie's on the panel, we work together, so part of my work is on display as well, but I'm also have like a curator hat on as well, and I'm trying to articulate the ways in which the notion, thoughts on how the thing is experienced start to become rigorous and instrumentalized. So in a certain way, I think the kind of early discourse on sensation and affect was like the work it seemed like the work already existed, and then it was just like talked about in different ways. It wasn't instrumental in the formation of the projects of individual, like digital formalists at the time, nor in individual projects. So it was just like a new way of talking about it, and it produced a kind of, it was often ambiguous and not specific. And I think that what's happened thus far is like when those words and those ways of thinking about form and art and experience were introduced into the discourse, and we kind of wrestled with them, they start to become, part of our project, and we work through them in very rigorous ways to think about form and new criteria. So I think that I want it to have, and I think in the work it does of these guys, it has a very thoughts about how it's experienced and how it's engaged. You can sort of read it in the work, or you can see it in the work and the formal articulation. There's a very specific relationship between the two. So, so I think part of like the work and why I'm happy to have these guys together and spend a little bit more time thinking about it is to try and make more explicit things which in the past have been like sort of elusive and unspecific, and to try to talk about those things as a designer as opposed to like a critic or a theorist.
Here's the question. I mean, how do you have that conversation with anyone, whether like when I look at Andy's work, like I guess they're beautiful and I love them, and the description of them is great, but it's still tied up in a kind of, despite what you're saying to me, a kind of how I would characterize, how I would feel them, how they evoke in some way. But I would be more curious to know like how you draw them, for instance. Like I think what's interesting about all of the stuff that was shown was there was either a model or a kind of prototype or a rendering, right? And for there to be the kind of, let's say, the conversation that you're claiming, I guess I would want to know how the people like myself that don't operate within that same frame would begin to engage or analyze or critique or have that conversation. And so, does that mean you have to develop new models or new methods of representation to be able to do it? I mean that quite sincerely, because I look at those things and I'm like, how do I begin to evaluate it in any other way than the way that we were evaluating the sort of old sensation projects from 5 years ago, which was talking about how it made us feel. I mean, I don't mean to belittle it, but I'm saying like that to me is what's at stake, and I'm wondering how it engages a large discipline.
Yeah, Adam, why aren't you showing any of my drawings?
You gave me these images. Why is everyone blaming me for the images they share?
Maybe it's not that I know there are drawings, but I would be curious what they are, and if you think that allows for that like a kind of different type of conversation, like a conversation on the level of analysis or even formal analysis to happen, or you just don't care.
Well, let's go to the image of one of Mikey's people in a pile of pillows, either pillow project. Yeah, either of those two. Does that rise to the occasion?
Just like in your question, going back in here,
Yeah, so to paraphrase Andrew Atwood's question, sort of a two-parter. The first is, how do you draw it? And then, how do you draw it as a means for evaluating it? So if we are staking some kind of a claim as to how it operates, he's basically saying prove it, and representation is the tool by which we need to do that. And I agree with the terms of that question, and I think we do need to prove it. And so I'm kind of pointing to these drawings as maybe an initial start. So I'm curious, like, why you draw things in this way, because this isn't like the first or the last time that like a plan appears in this way, where the figure kind of disappears. And to you, is this like a device that lets you prove the operation of the thing, or is the drawing something else here?
Well, I mean, I think we used to actually be huge fans of drawing, and we've kind of, right now, all we do is models. Like, we hardly do any sort of drawings, and I think for our work, drawings are just, they don't prove anything. The models are what proves it, and that's why, I mean, I don't know if that's addressing the question, but for us, the drawings are a way to, are just a communication method before we get to the model making. And so for us, model making is key, and actually prototypes and physical objects. And that's how we can test this stuff out in reality. These are they're important to get us going, but yeah.
Maybe to respond to your description of the drawings, and also to kind of get at I think there's something else about these drawings. I just said it's documentation or
maybe to respond to both Mikey and Andrew Atwood, I was going to say that there's something about these drawings that do more than just documenting it or proving anything, or even representation. I actually think it exudes a kind of ineffable quality, which I would say deadpan, right? I think that these drawings have a deadpan quality to it, and it's a quality that you can't really prove or disprove. It's really comical, it's humorous, and it's also delivered in a very specific fashion, right? I think the way you say it is kind of, and so in a way I feel like these drawings do that. And if I were to kind of also understand the framing of it, when you were talking about bricks and when you were talking about Andrew's the pick project and the pick in a box, were you trying to insinuate that the part-to-whole relationship becomes irrelevant when whole cannot and does not want to be perceived?
I mean, I think for me, it's interesting on multiple levels. So I think that, like, oftentimes there's different like you can kind of view the work through different valences. I think there's earlier in your panel this afternoon, there was questions about iconicity, but basically ways in which you could interpret or that would be really loud.
Can we turn it off?
So there's a way in which maybe an object has, I think this is like Bob's description of shape, Bob Summel's description of shape, or even the way like Charles Jenks talks about iconicity and his sort of drawings of metaphorical drawings. I mean, there's a way in which an object is interpreted that you can perceive in total that is one conversation about figure that you can have. I think the ways in which, and both Andrew and Mikey in different ways, and I think Andrew with a kind of hyper specificity that I'm really intrigued by is thinking about part-to-part relationships in a new way, which I think are a new take on bricks in the same way that the blob wall is a new take on bricks.
Can I chime in on the pigs in a box?
Sure.
Yeah, so there I would say it's not that the whole is irrelevant, it's that the whole is a tease. So it's actually like the anticipation of the thing that you can never ascertain directly, but you know must exist, that is the kind of like payoff, the pleasure of the part to whole, like a teasy whole. That's what I'm after.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that it's like a Baroque idea, you know, and this is something that came up earlier, like the difference between a Renaissance and Baroque is articulated by Wolfland, is that, you know, the Renaissance, you can sort of perceive the whole in every part, but the Baroque, you withhold, like the Baroque withholds the kind of image of the whole, and you experience it in movement. And I think that's, I mean, the ability for it to both talk to bricks and for me to talk to the Baroque is a kind of, it speaks to the depth of the project in a way that I think is pretty remarkable. I really want to at least show some of Ellie's work, and maybe you can respond to this question. I mean, because like I think that the question of sensation is important to you, and I think it's tied into this project. It's tied into the like that moment, and it's potentially a new take on that moment. You're developing that project, so I don't know. Do you want to respond to that?
You want to riff on that?
Just say go.
I mean, is there a specific?
No, so if you don't want to weigh in, you don't have to weigh in, but I mean, I think that maybe articulating the way in which sensation plays into your work and how it's maybe instrumentalized in your work. Because I think in part of the ways, I think also what Andrew's question is asking, Andrew Atwood, your question is asking about disciplinary legibility. How do you communicate about these things which are based in experience and can be written off as completely subjective? How do you then talk about them, share any kind of, I mean, the formal analysis thing is like that's legible. We can understand it as a technique of analysis. I think one of the answers is that these things, we should work on these things. It's a project in formation, and it's a project that needs to be worked on for quite some time. But I think that, it's things that these issues we've thought about for a number of years now, and we've worked out in our work. And, how are those more legible and more instrumental in this sense than they were maybe 5 years ago or something like that.
Well, I mean, I think Andrew's question is really interesting. A really interesting one, because I think that for the work that I do, the proof is not in the drawing. I don't think it could be in the drawing. I mean, I think drawing is really instrumental in other ways. So largely, I think about drawing as I think about ways that I can leverage drawing as a mediator between kind of technology or fabrication tools and materiality, but not as a way that I can leverage drawing kind of intradisciplinarily to kind of engage a conversation with colleagues. I think that proof actually resides in the thing itself, and this is, I guess, kind of where things get slippery. So I'm kind of I'm interested in the challenge of the question. I don't know that I actually have a great answer for it here. I think that, the kind of disciplinary territory that the work engages is one that's more about materiality and a kind of lineage that you could track from, modernism through kind of phenomenology and then to the contemporary conversations about sensation, and an attitude towards materiality which distinguishes itself from those previous historical models and is in search of kind of novel perceptual or sensory experiences, but which are heavily invested in a kind of multiplicitous subject or something different, I guess, than the way that Andrew or even Mike are thinking about engagement. And then this is not, I don't have like a kind of conclusive statement about this, but one of the really interesting things for me since the beginning of conversations around the Tactile Objects group of workshops has been the question of scale and the question of interiority and the questions surrounding the kind of occupation of an object. Because there are ways in which, for instance, there are ways in which Andrew talks about pigs in box that resonate with the way that I like to think about my work, which is this Baroque idea of kind of movement, which is the tease or the thing which you can't which isn't easily comprehensible in a moment, but has to be experienced over time to understand. But the kind of relationship between a participant or an audience and the work is radically different in that. And Andrew talks about it like an object, and I talk about it like a kind of immersive space. And so I'm just kind of interested in that question, that like, is the object, must you always be outside the object in order for it to retain its objecthood? Although when you move to the brick question, you're actually talking about maybe a totally different relationship between the body and the object, where the objects, in a way, define a kind of envelope or boundary between interior and exterior, or one space and another, perhaps, but aren't something that you kind of move around or circulate around. I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder, does the roof of Purple Bub? We're back. Does the roof of Purple Bub answer that question? So, just to paraphrase, what is the relationship between objects and space making? Do you make hollow objects and climb inside them, or can aggregations of objects become habitable? And if you are trying to work out the problem of aggregation, does the object lose its status as an object? So if I truly snuggle my way to a building, in the end, won't I just get kind of complex bricks that lose their kind of value, their status as an object? And I guess I'm hopeful that the roof of Purple Bub strikes the right kind of balance, and maybe it's just an issue of quantity and scale. But those seem to me like they are both an aggregation, and the figures float freely and retain a kind of status in that aggregation. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
It's one of the thoughts that I have when I'm looking at static images of the work. In the back of my head, I'm thinking I just have to believe you guys. It's sort of like, I look at the work and it's rich, and there's a kind of a texture to it all. But really, I think what's curious here for me is that the images obviously aren't doing it justice. It's really not the way, nor is the drawing really the way to experience the work. You really kind of have to be there, especially with some of the pieces that you have to sort of sniff and you have to touch, and they're really tactile. And that's really different, maybe, with Andrew Atwood's sort of question about analysis, right? I mean, I think there's been moments in architecture where there would be conversations like this, and let's say the documents that would actually back up the work, right? It wasn't just like we had to trust them. There was a documentation. There was like, okay, we did this, and there was a kind of a formal, analytical, let's say, set of kind of techniques that one would kind of operate on, and there was a kind of body of knowledge, right, that was kind of formulated within architecture that would allow a kind of entry point into that work that was kind of legible. So I'm kind of struck here in a way by thinking in my head, okay, maybe, but I just have to trust you guys. And I'm actually really curious about that. I mean, in the kind of the disciplinary sense, going back to Andrew's point, is what does that actually mean in a way? Because I know that our work falls into that also. Oftentimes, we present our work, you've probably all had friends who they have a kid, and they say, look how cute my kid is, and they're playing with they're holding the cheeks, and they're like, he's a beautiful kid. And in the back of your head, you're thinking, that is one ugly little kid, right? But everyone's kid is the most beautiful kid in the world. And you can't contest that, right? And so I'm sitting here in my head thinking kind of the same thing. Like I'm nothing here in a way, I can't contest it, right? I believe you guys in your own frame. It's fantastic work. But I guess I am also, in my own way, thinking about how do we, because the kind of theme of the conference is sort of possible mediums, right? And so how do we sort of interrogate this as yesterday in a way the framing of this was sort of like looking at process, right? Looking at the process of the formation of these things. Right. And so I'm like, when I look at it in that kind of framework, I'm not only just thinking about your work, I'm thinking about my own work in that lens. And in this generation, and also, you guys set this up. You're UCLA. It's like the LA invasion here. It's like and which is awesome. And I'm also thinking of someone like Greg Lynn, who's obviously influenced you guys, and thinking of how he started. And if you look at his thesis project when he was a grad student, when you look at some of his formative work, he was actually it was emerging out of a kind of fascination with analytical models about motion, right, and the kind of relationship between energy and form, say. It emerged out of a kind of analytical process, and that early work opened up a lot of terrain for us, I would say. But anyways, I guess I'm kind of I'm trying to just sort of tease out what's at stake here. How do we begin to?
Let me ask you, isn't that the case with looking at an image of a Stephen Hall work in the same way? Jeff very clearly makes a distinction between the phenomenological project, the conceptual project, and I think he calls it the social project or something like that. But the conceptual project basically, it the experience of the thing often contradicts its sort of status in representation. So for someone like Eisenman's projects, it's actually better to just look at the drawings. You get the project. When you're there, the experience actually is against what the project is about. The phenomenological project like Stephen Hall or something, basically it's about, you sort of have to be, it's about producing a new experience, a new world that you actually have to experience in person to get. It's not really, drawings don't really do it that much work. So I think I don't think anyone here at this point is ready to say with the same conviction that the phenomenologists do about a state of experience which is universal, that they just work every project toward. I think some of the work, I think that Ellie and I feel a particular burden to this is updating phenomenology to have a more contemporary notion of the subject built into it. But I think that one of the things which I'm interested in and I think is important is engaging experience despite its slipperiness and the fact that you have to take my word for it, and somehow internalizing that within our sort of working methods. And I think that one of the things that the digital kind of formalist education that we got gave us was a commitment to rigor. So sequencing these things and trying to fold in those criteria which are sort of slippery into something which can be more legible and gets worked on iteratively and starts to move towards, I think, probably a metacritical position on the work, or a state of the subject that we can explicitly say we're working towards. I mean, maybe it's not actually that good for designers to speak so absolutely in that way. I think that's when critics are often good to guide. But so I think that for me in particular, these issues and the qualities of this work are absolutely difficult to make legible. It puts pressure on representation, conventions of representation like drawing. Oftentimes video helps a little bit, but that doesn't mean that, I think architecture is experienced by people, and being able to own that, being able to approach that in some kind of serious way seems like, for me personally, a really useful and essential thing to be able to approach, instead of just kind of standing back because it's tricky. So, that would be sort of my response.
The way I hear the question is where did your alibi go? And I guess there's a bunch of answers. Definitively, our alibi is no longer in the past. And by that I mean to position this work against the panel earlier in the day. History is not a reservoir for our work in quite the same way. But I would also say that our alibi is not in the past, in the sense that process and the procedure of making does not justify the thing that we have made. So no record of how these things are made are ever going to fulfill the ambition of, or explain the ambition of the project. So I think, all right, if the alibi is not in the past, is the alibi a post-rationalization of the thing after you've made it? I think that's a little closer to home, but probably also not quite good enough. So we could be drawing these things after making them, video like the experience, like record people interacting with them, and I think Burplebup did that successfully in a couple of cases, like someone's licking it, the experience is happening. I think another answer to the question, like, where did your alibi go? The answer I want is, like, the alibi is in the object. It is, the project is self-evident. And so when we produce a kind of, like, biomorphic rhyme, the rhyme is there. And if we need to work out the kind of the clarity of that rhyme and the universality of that rhyme, I think that's fine, but I would like a kind of infolding of attention into the thing so that the alibi like behind me or the alibi in front of me just matters a lot less.
Of all the projects. It seems that there's...
Repeat that?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that the alibi for me seems to be clarified or made more legible in all the titles. Never have I seen a group of projects that rely so heavily on the titles, I would say with the exception of maybe Pigs in a Blanket or Mustachio, where the title entices me to ask more, right? Maybe it makes it project a little more opaque, but outside of those two, I would say that everything is trying to kind of affirm what I see. Like Ellie, with yours, it relies a lot on affirming kind of the elements at play. And just I'm curious about that too, like whether or not, I don't know, for you, the titles seem to be doing double duty, like a lot of work. Like, are you skeptical that people won't get it?
No, I mean, I actually don't think I intentionally put that much weight on the title, but I'll confess that I also find that to be one of the most difficult parts of a project. And maybe that's so maybe that reveals that I do put a lot of weight on the title, right? I mean, I guess I could call it Untitled number 1 or Room number 1, right? But I mean, I think that's an interesting observation. Yeah.
I don't know, does Burplebup clarify the project? Does various fats at play clarify the project? I don't know if sort of like the worst hearing of the question is your title's your crutch. I don't know if that's happening.
Cool. I think we're going long, so I'm hesitant to keep poking and prodding. So I don't have any definitive last statements. I think that the I think the conversation is great. I hope it continues. I want to let you guys get back to work. I don't know if anyone has any kind of final statements. We'll take it to dinner, hash it out. All right. Thanks, guys.